I never imagined that returning home from deployment would involve a showdown with the most notorious person in our neighborhood. Yet that's exactly what happened the moment I stepped back on a familiar ground. After 18 grueling months overseas as a federal agent embedded with military intelligence, all I wanted was a quiet surprise for my wife and kids. Instead, I found myself face to face with Susan Miller, the self-appointed tyrant of our homeowners association, known behind her back as HOA Karen. My plan had been simple. My brother-in-law Thomas would help me sneak into the house while my wife picked up the kids from school. We'd hang a small welcome home banner in the front yard. Nothing flashy, just enough to make the moment memorable. I'd just landed a few hours earlier, still in uniform, and Thomas was helping me carry my bags from his car to the front door when that unmistakable voice cut through the afternoon calm. "Excuse me? What exactly do you think you're doing?" Susan marched. Across the street, clipboard in hand, pearls bouncing against her crisp white blouse. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled into a painfully tight bun, and her face held the expression of someone who had just caught teens vandalizing the community mailboxes. Thomas froze, but I continued unlocking the door. "Hi there," I said, keeping my tone calm, "just surprising my family." Susan crossed her arms and tilted her head. "And you are?" she asked, scrutinizing me as if my military uniform and house key were elaborate props for a burglary. "I'm David Vance. I live here. This is my home," I replied, keeping my composure despite the jet lag and emotional exhaustion. Susan sniffed. "Well, Mr. Vance, did you submit a form for that?" She pointed at the small banner Thomas had staked into the lawn. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA bylaws requires approval for all yard decorations, with a minimum 14-day notice. In that uniform, are you actually military, or is this some costume party? I should have been prepared. My wife had warned me in video calls that Susan had been elected HOA president 6 months earlier, turning our once friendly neighborhood into her personal fiefdom. But reading about it was nothing compared to experiencing it firsthand. "Ma'am, I've been deployed for 18 months. I'm just trying to surprise my family. The banner will be up only a few hours," I explained, feeling my patience begin to fray. "Rules are rules, Mr. Vance, if that's truly your name. I don't recall approving long-term absences for military service. Did you file the extended absence form?" "And what about lawn maintenance? We sent 3 violation notices about your grass last summer." Thomas, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "Susan, come on. David has been serving our country. Can't you let this one slide? The banner will be gone tonight." Susan's eyes narrowed as she pulled out her phone. "No exceptions. I'm documenting this violation, and you'll receive a fine. I'll also need to see identification proving you live here and aren't impersonating someone else." That's when I realized she wasn't just photographing the banner. She was taking pictures of me in my uniform. It felt invasive, disrespectful, almost criminal. After everything I'd endured over the past year and a half, "Ma'am, I'd appreciate it if you didn't photograph me without consent," I said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I've traveled over 30 hours to get home and want to settle in before my family arrives." Susan stepped closer, phone still raised. "This is HOA property, and I have every right to document violations. For all I know, you could be impersonating military personnel, which is a federal offense. Show me your ID and proof of residence, or I'm calling the police." The absurdity of it all was almost comedic. After serving my country, I was being accused of stolen valor on my own lawn. I reached for my wallet to pull out my military ID, but before I could, Susan gasped dramatically. "Is that a weapon?" she shrieked, pointing at the faint outline of my service firearm beneath my jacket. "It's a federal agent. I was authorized to carry it even while traveling, but explaining that to Susan felt futile, ma'am. I'm a federal agent on active duty." I'm authorized to carry this weapon, I said calmly. Showing her my federal credentials alongside my military ID, I hoped the badge would de-escalate the situation, but I had severely underestimated her commitment to her self-appointed authority. A likely story: first unauthorized decorations, then military claims, now a badge and a concealed weapon. I'm calling 911. Thomas's eyes went wide. Susan, seriously? Stop. David is the real deal. My sister's been talking about his return for weeks. Too late. Susan was already on the phone, her voice rising as she painted a picture of a suspicious armed man in a military costume threatening HOA personnel. I calmly pulled out my phone and began recording, capturing her false report for the record. Ma'am, I'm documenting this conversation because you're making false statements to law enforcement, which is a crime. I've already identified myself as a resident and a federal agent. And I've shown you my credentials. Susan's face flushed with anger. Stop recording me immediately. That's another violation of HOA privacy policies. Section 12, paragraph 7 clearly states, I interrupted calmly, keeping my voice steady, ma'am, federal law supersedes HOA bylaws. Making false reports to emergency services is a serious offense. The next 20 minutes were surreal. Susan refused to end her call. With 911 pacing back and forth on my front lawn while spinning a tale that painted me as increasingly aggressive even though my demeanor remained completely calm. She even suggested Thomas might be my accomplice in some imagined crime. When the police finally arrived, 2 officers approached cautiously, hands near their weapons. I kept my hands visible and immediately identified myself, explaining the situation. One of the officers, a veteran himself, recognized my uniform and credentials instantly. Agent Vance, welcome home, sir, he said, with a nod after verifying my identity. Sorry about the welcome committee. His gaze lingered pointedly on Susan, still clutching her clipboard like a shield. This is outrageous, she protested as the officers confirmed my identity and federal status. He still violated HOA protocols. That banner wasn't approved, and as president of this association, I demand it be removed immediately. The older officer turned to her with a weary expression. Ma'am, did you just call 911 to report a welcome home banner for a returning federal agent? Susan hesitated. I called about an armed man trespassing and impersonating military personnel. The officer shook his head. According to Agent Vance's recording, he identified himself and showed you his federal credentials before you call. That is a false report. Filing false reports ties up emergency resources and is a criminal offense. Susan's face went pale, then quickly flushed red again. I was doing my duty as HOA president. How was I supposed to know he was actually military? Anyone can buy a uniform. Online these days, the younger officer who had been taking notes looked up. Ma'am, is it accurate that Agent Vance identified himself and showed credentials before you called 911? Susan stammered, suddenly less certain. Well, he showed me something, but how was I supposed to know if it was real? I was being cautious. I decided it was time to regain control. Officers, I don't want to press charges. If Ms. Miller is willing to admit her error and leave us in peace, all I want is to surprise my family when they get home. The officers exchanged glances and looked at Susan, giving her a graceful way out. But Susan Miller had not risen to HOA president by backing down. This isn't over, she hissed, eyes narrowing. The HOA board will hear about this blatant disregard for our community standards. Expect a formal violation notice and fine within the week. With that, she spun on her heel and marched across the street, shoulders rigid with indignation. I thought that would be the end of it, a frustrating but minor welcome home incident. I was wrong. While waiting for my family, I received a neighborhood-wide email from Susan warning residents about dangerous individuals claiming military affiliation, urging, Them to report suspicious activity, clearly referring to me without naming me directly. When my wife and kids arrived, their joy at seeing me early quickly overshadowed Susan's antics. We had a beautiful reunion, and for a few hours, I almost forgot the HOA drama. The next morning, however, I awoke to a formal violation notice taped to our front door, citing multiple infractions, unauthorized signage, failure to submit proper extended absence documentation, and most absurdly, intimidation of HOA personnel. The fine: an outrageous $500 with an additional $50 for each day. The violations remained unresolved. There was even a separate motion to begin eviction proceedings for persistent and willful breaches of community standards. That was the final straw. I spent the day collecting stories from neighbors who had been similarly harassed in my absence, families cited for basketball hoops visible from the street, an elderly resident penalized for planting unauthorized flowers, a cancer patient fined for not retrieving trash cans. Promptly, armed with this evidence and the recording of Susan's false police report, I contacted the HOA attorney directly, bypassing Susan entirely. I explained my federal status and detailed the legal implications of her actions: harassment of a federal agent, filing a false police report, attempted intimidation, and abuse of HOA authority. The attorney was appropriately alarmed, especially when I noted that making false statements to federal personnel could be prosecuted as a federal offense. While I had no intention of pursuing that angle, the mere suggestion sent ripples through the HOA's legal team. Within 48 hours, I received a formal apology from the HOA board. They scheduled an emergency meeting, during which Susan was removed as president and fined $2,000 personally for her abuse of power and the legal risks she had created. The look on her face when the board voted unanimously was priceless. A mixture of shock, fury, and the realization that her little clipboard kingdom had real-world consequences. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to HOA Conflicts for more.